Hi, folks. Welcome back to another episode of Esoterica loses a dozen subscribers by defending a curmudgeonly mid-20th century German guy, starring Dr. Angela Pucca of Angela Symposium and Theodore Adorno. So, welcome, Dr. Pucca. Welcome, Angela. Thank you for coming back and talking with me about this. This guy that
and the
you
that I don't like very much. There's
what
there's one of my patron who always makes memes of me eye rolling.
that's funny. Well, I'm going to believe that the fact that you dislike Adorno so much and you keep coming back means that you like me. So I'm going to take that as for all the reasons that you dislike Adorno, I'm going to take the fact that you're willing to put up with him to hang out with me and at least throw shade on him. I'm going to take that as a
Yes, that
sideways
is.
compliment.
Yes,
So
it is a compliment, Justin.
um
But I
and
also
yeah,
think that it's interesting to to discuss. I kind of like also to enter into arguments that I disagree with, so that you can unpack things and understand things better about the way you think. And I don't know, I find it very educational.
I think so too, and even if I agree with him in some ways, there's lots of ways that I don't, and I think part of what also is just good is that just trying to understand what the hell he's talking about is really intellectually challenging, and it's like
Yeah.
it's not just like I disagree with him or I agree with him. It's like, oh yeah, this is a really important thinker who writes in a very obtuse way. How do you actually unpack what he's saying and figuring out what he's saying to agree with it or not? So in that way, I think he's I like to read Adorno for the same reason, the same masochistic reasons. Like I like to read, French mid-century continental thought and Deleuze or whatever, these kinds of people. So it's
Cassirer.
yeah,
I find him very difficult.
yeah.
Husserl.
Oh, Husserl, yeah. I think Husserl's not that bad. I mean, I don't. I guess it depends on what he's writing. Like Ideas 1 and 2 isn't too hard. I mean,
Mm.
and I guess it's also like if you kind of know what he's up to, then he's not too terrible. Or Heidegger or something. The late Heidegger is just like if I'm going to read mysticism, I'll just go read Meister Eckhart or something. I don't know. Take that, Heidegger. At least the late Heidegger. I like the early Heidegger. He's just fun. But all right. Well, folks, also I've done a thing. What I've done, and this is to maybe help us a little bit in terms of keeping track of Adorno's argument, is I've actually gone through and summarized them and rendered them in argument form. I'm fairly confident I'm getting the drift of what his argument is. I'm maybe if an Adorno expert wants to say I'm getting it wrong, but I think I know his basic argument. Um, and so what I want to do is just summarize up to thesis 3 as to what his positions are. Because I think that a lot of the comments I see are people criticizing Adorno because they just don't like what he's saying, but I don't know that we're totally on the same page about what he's saying. And I think that being on the page about what he's saying is he's not saying things like occultists are stupid. That's not what he's saying. Um, so it's really important to get what he's after. And what I want to do is summarize where we're at up to thesis 3, and then we'll pick up with thesis 4, and that'll give us sort of a background to where he is. And I'll try to go through these quickly so we're not taking a bunch of time on this. Can I cycle from here? No, I can't. So let me move this tab over here. All right. So I had to do it like black and white, super stark, because it's like this is the only thing
I
Adorno.
find it interesting that you called it on occultism instead of against.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I should change it. Maybe there's like a secret, some secret thing I'm communicating. It's some kind of Freudian
Maybe I'm
slip.
persuading you live stream by live stream.
Hey, but maybe, or maybe it's just that I take his critique to be so ipso facto true that I don't even think of it as against him.
Mm.
It could cut either way. So at any rate, he starts off famously, right, that there's been a regression of consciousness. And the regression of consciousness that he's most interested in here is fascism. And this is what he would call a reactionary mass irrationalism. And that regression of consciousness takes primarily the form of fascism. Now, he doesn't say that occultism is a regression of consciousness. He says that it's a symptom of that regression, right? So it's in itself not a regression. It's a symptom of the regression. I think that's a very small but important detail. So his general track is going to be to attack occultism primarily along the lines of the general attack of historical materialism on religion, but he thinks that occultism is a very particular kind of species of religion, and that in the way that it emerges in sort of late capitalism, it's going to have a particular form, and he's attacking that particular form. So if you think of religion as the genus, he's using historical materialism to attack religion, but a particular kind of attack he's leading on occultism. And I've given an equal def for occultism. Obviously, that's not a real equal def because this is not an analytic definition of occultism, and that's why I put the little asterisk there to be like it's a reconstructed, and it's not analytic. But welcome to me doing analytic philosophy. It's how I was trained. And this is where I think I might disagree, Angela, where the idea that he's attacking sort of pop occultism, I'm increasingly not convinced of that. Now, we can talk about why more later. But I'm trying to give him a definition of occultism, basically build out of what he was arguing. And the way I define it is a reversion to pre-critical metaphysics and subjectivism, its accompanying social practices under the conditions of late capitalism, and the ideological forms it takes. Ideological there being the Marxist jargon for that term, right? I'm not using ideology in just things you believe, but ideology in the Marxist way that that term gets used. If you're familiar with Slavoj Žižek, that term, that way of using the word ideology, should have maybe capitalized it. So I think that's what he means by occultism, right? That it's a combination of a reversion of pre-critical metaphysics, subjectivism, and the accompanying social practices that emerge under late capitalism and the ideological forms it takes. And it's also just to be pointed out that Adorno accepts a Hegelian view of philosophical progress. That's what he means by consciousness, right? You can disagree with him, and if you disagree with him, basically you disagree with everything else that comes later. So he thinks that a Hegelian theory of philosophical progress is true if it's checked by historical materialism, but what's really important is that he rejects both Hegel and Marxist teleology. And he's picking that up from Benjamin. So folks who know the Angel of History stuff from Benjamin, that's really playing a role in Adorno's uptake of historical materialism. So he accepts historical materialism. He accepts a critique of capitalism. He rejects Marxist teleology. It's very important, very important. So thesis 2, right? The historical materialist critique applies to occultism, but with unique features, because occultism is a particular kind of religion. So he argues that history had an appropriate relationship to reality. That's the subject-object dialectic, right? That there was nature and us, and there was an appropriate relationship between us and nature, or us and the divine. That was a subject-object dialectic. And he opposes that to the dialectic that emerges in the Enlightenment, the dialectic of enlightenment, where there's subject-object hegemony, which is to say the subject attempts to achieve Herrschaft or hegemony over the object. What's going to happen is that as the theses develop, he's going to argue that what occultism does is that it reverses that, is that the subject-object relationship, the dialectic is broken, and the subject is sort of loose in a certain kind of way. So we'll get to that in a minute. So what occultism does is it adopts pre-critical thought forms in a hypermodern situation, and of necessity, because it's adopting those in a hypermodern hypermodern context, it takes the form it's going to take contemporary social thought forms, especially the thought forms of reification and commodity fetishism. Also, it's going to take the form of division of labor. So he thinks that those three things are operating in occultism in a very, very exacerbated way, and even in a way that they don't operate in religion, general religion, Catholicism, Judaism, Islam, even less so Islam and stuff, because it's less connected to modernity in his mind, I think. So reification, commodity fetishism, and the division of labor. So keep those in mind. And so what he thinks happens is, because this occultism is developing in this hypermodern context, the fetishes, the objects that it creates, take the commodity form. That should be unsurprising. That's classic sort of Marxism stuff. but that the ideology that emerges is an ideology that is also typical of late capitalism, liberalism, which is the ideology of the autonomous subject. So he argues in Thesis 2 that the fetishism of the commodities creates commodities that are fetishes. The fetishes become commodities. These metaphysical entities become fetishes. They take the form of the commodity, and the kind of ideology that develops is the ideology of the autonomous subject. And this is especially true in metaphysics, right? And that's what we talk about when we mean pre-critical metaphysics. Pre-critical metaphysics is the idea that you can just do metaphysics without having to do the work of folks like Kant and Hegel. So the idea that you can ad hoc do metaphysics, what some people now call guerrilla metaphysics or object-oriented ontology, all that kind of stuff. Adorno would hate that stuff. So if you're familiar with OOO, object-oriented ontology, all of that would be, to his mind, pre-critical metaphysics. Which is not surprising, by the way, that so much people who are interested in OOO and the kind of world that like Nick Land and that school come from are also crossing over into the occult world as well. That is very interesting to me. And I think Adorno predicted it really, really well. Like really interestingly predicted that outcome. Thesis 3, which brings us up to where we were last time, right? So he argues that occultism operates as ideology. That's not surprising. Religion operates as ideology. We should be totally unsurprised at that. But it operates in a uniquely ironic form of false consciousness, right? So again, thinking back to the German ideology, Marx's critique of consciousness, right? The German ideology and his critique of false consciousness. And what he argues, that Adorno argues for, is that by engaging with another world, and I put another world here in scare quotes because he doesn't think it's real, because it engages another world that's filtered through the medium of modernity and late capitalism, it's going to recreate the social conditions and thought forms of the very world that it wishes to escape or complete or change or transform or redeem or whatever term you want to use. So the world that it tries to escape to or create or engage with is just going to reproduce the exact same thought forms and social relations in that world, right? Whether it's the world of the gods, the world of the spirits, or the ancestors, or whatever, that it actually is trying to get distance from in this world. And what's even more ironic, and that's just true of religion in general. Religion always recreates the thought forms of the world that it comes from. A great example of this is the Goetia, right? When the writer of the Goetia imagines the world of the demons, look at the social forms it takes. It's just a bunch of aristocrats. It just recreates feudalism in another world because that's the world it's coming from, right? You get dukes and barons and all that stuff, and you're like, why would there be dukes and barons and blah, 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 knights and stuff? Well, of course there would be, because that's the world you're coming from. And when you think of powerful people, you recreate that in another world. So what he's going to argue here is the exact same thing is going to happen with the so-called occult world. But this is where he thinks this is especially ironic given the world of occultism, is that the world that it creates under the commodity form is, interestingly enough, the least real aspects of this world. The fetishism of the commodity means that it recreates over there in the other world a world of commodities. And commodities are, according to Adorno and Marxism, the least real aspect of our world. They're the aspect of our world completely created by human beings, right? And its social relations are mediated by capital, which we invent, and thought itself as ideology. So for him, the claim that they have access, occultists have access to a more true world, is rendered all the more ironic, considering that the least true elements of our world are the elements that go into constructing that world. And he thinks that is the real, that's not only the irony of it, but it's the danger. Because what is in our world completely false, the commodity relation, gets recreated in another world, but that world now is the unique place for which people gain gnosis or truth or religious truth or the wisdom of the ancestors or the Akashic record or whatever. And it becomes a case that the least true thing, the most false thing in our world, is now transcendentalized and made the source for absolute truth in another world. And Adorno thinks that it's not just ironic, it's terrifying. And so that's and very dangerous, right? Very, very dangerous. And we'll see how it works out in a very dangerous way as we get into thesis 4. That's where I think he lands by the third thesis. I think that's where he lands, where we wrapped up last time. Maybe we got through thesis 4. Angela, are you sure we only got through thesis 3?
No, I'm not sure.
Maybe we can start with thesis 4.
No, I don't remember doing thesis 4 because there's Kafka and Latin, and I don't recall that.
All right. So the Kafka and the Latin reminds us. Okay. Does that summary sound correct to you? Not correct in the sense that you agree with it, obviously, but correct in the sense that that is what Adorno seems to be doing.
Yeah, I think so. To me, the first thesis tends to focus on the instrumental reason, the second one on commodification, and the third one on the concept of regression. There's also the element of he thinking of the occult as something that is a pre-rational understanding of the word.
I don't think he thinks it's pre-rational. I think he thinks it's a uniquely modern form of irrationality. That the regression is happening. It's not like the occultist is regressing back to a previous time, but they're regressing in a unique modern way. That the regression is happening in a unique modern context. For instance, with the exception of some maybe strange people, I don't know anyone who really believes Agrippa's metaphysics. Like no one's aside from like flat earthers or something, no one's a geocentrist. And Agrippa's system really only works at some level with a geocentric worldview. Like it assumes a geocentric worldview. So stuff like that. I don't think that no one's regressing in the sense that they're going back to thinking. Like no one is believing in the active intelligence. I don't think, which is like kind of what or stellar. I mean, maybe some people believe in stellar rays, but most people are not going back to pre-critical medieval thought forms. I don't even know that's possible. It'd be interesting if you could do that. I wish I could believe in the active intelligence. It's one of my favorite ideas ever. Or like the Stoic. I wish I could believe in Stoic metaphysics, or Stoic physics for that matter.
I'm going back and forth between your slide and the thesis by Adorno.
You may share this with you, Angela. I can.
No, it's fine. I mean, I can focus on what I'm seeing now, which is thesis 3. I think it is. I think it is a good summary, although I still see a lot of biases in a way. I mean, a very specific understanding of the occultism, which I think you expressed in slide 1.
Mm-hmm. And again, I'm not saying this is what occultism is. I'm saying this is what Adorno thinks it is. And this is me going through every time he seems to give something like a definition of what he thinks it is, I'm trying to pack in what he thinks it is. Obviously, this is not what occultists think they're doing, because, I mean, they wouldn't be doing it if they thought they were doing this, I don't think. And again, whether it's fair or not, it's probably not fair, but I think that this is basically what he thinks is happening.
And you agree with him?
I agree in a general way. Yeah, I agree that I agree that all of these things are bad. That, what should say, incorrect. Like pre-critical metaphysics is a mistake. Like reverting to that is not a thing. You can't just do metaphysics. I do agree that Kant is right, basically, in that.
What do you mean there by pre-critical?
That you could that we have.
Is it what I was saying about the pre-rational? His perception of it being pre-rational.
No, it's the idea that sort of the Kantian, like when I say pre-critical, I'm just meaning like sort of pure, like the way that Kant criticized Leibniz, right? That we don't have direct apperception of the metaphysical world, and therefore we have to do some transcendental philosophy in order to get access to the metaphysical world, and that will always be limited by. And we can argue about what it'll be limited by. Kant has his, the furniture of the mind, as he puts it, right? That does the limiting. But I think that the argument is that any return to I would say that any return to a pre-critical metaphysics is just not viable. That is to say, we don't have direct apperception of metaphysical truths. We may disagree about that. And there are people actively now in philosophy that disagree with that as well. Like I said, the object-oriented ontology people.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking whether that is what happens in occultism. I'm not convinced that that is what happens in occultism. So if we're thinking here about pre-critical metaphysics and subjectivity, meaning pre-critical in terms of Kantian terms, right? So it would mean a metaphysics that is not criticized in a Kantian sense. It is perceived as something that you directly experience. Okay, so I would say that there are some traditions where that is the case, and other traditions where it is not the case. So, for instance, in shamanism, that would be true because there's very much the sense of the direct experience with the spirits and the divine. But I'm not convinced that that is what happens in other forms of occultism.
I mean, I'd be curious to see. I've never seen a theory of occultism that includes a critical apparatus a la Kant. Like what we can know and what we can't know and why we can't know those things. Like from logic, like philosophically argued. I mean, it'd be interesting to see like a theory of the occult that offers a critical metaphysics, that offers a critical apparatus to its metaphysics. I've not seen that. I would like to see it. But someone like Agrippa just comes right out and starts doing a metaphysics. There's no critical apparatus. I mean, he thinks the Gnostics, right? They think that you can just get there's no barrier, there's no mediation. Or there's no mediation once you break through the false reality of the physical world or whatever. So
what about theosophy?
I mean, they think you can get access to the Akashic record. I mean, that's just like straight up everything. I mean, that's exactly what Kant writes. It's exactly the kind of thing that Kant writes against, right? In the in the footnotes of the first and second critique, or the first critique, precisely because of the work he had done with on Swedenborg and Jakob Boehme. I mean, in fact, one argument can be made that early theosophy, Jakob Boehme and its uptake in Swedenborg, is precisely the reason why the first critique was written, because Kant was working on that stuff. The visions of a spirit seer or whatever. And he was really interested in those claims. And ultimately, the first critique is meant in some ways to prevent that. The third critique's a little squirrely there, because sometimes he seems in the footnotes to say you can have direct apperception of at least aesthetic objects. But there's a lot of debate about that. But even that, still, there's not much light between the first and third critique there. And again, I say reversion to pre-critical metaphysics, but someone can also just say, no, I'm going to do object-oriented ontology. And there are people out there doing it, and they don't give a damn about what Kant says. And again, pre-critical is not here specifically Kantian, but because I'm not a Kantian in that sense. But I think this is the argument. Again, Adorno. So if there's an Adorno expert out there, feel free to critique my summary. But I'm fairly confident this is what he's arguing. What's also interesting is now that I'm reading it again, rebuilding the argument, it's a lot tighter of an argument than I thought it was at first. On Arthur Sleep, yeah, it's not a question of imagination, because Kant thinks the imagination is an infinite category. The question is not whether the imagination is infinite. It is. The question is whether or not it is a transcendental structure of thought. He thinks that it is incapable of doing that, and that's a huge difference between modern philosophy and medieval philosophy. For Descartes to Kant and everyone else in the modern period, the imagination is a thing that structures things, it builds things in the mind, whereas opposed to in the Middle Ages, imagination is a thing that perceives things and builds things, but it's also an organ of mental perception, and that door is closed after Kant, basically. Well, in critical philosophy.
I'm not sure what to respond to that, because I think we got too deeply into philosophical terminology, and it makes us lose the connection with occultism, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, we could jump back into jump to thesis 4 and just pick back up where we were and try to go forward from there.
Yeah, I was re-looking at the thesis. I think your summary is a good one, and to me, what Adorno is saying, it is still quite biased, I have to say. When I reread the first 3 theses that we have gone through in the past couple of live streams, to me, as I said, the first one tends to hint at the irrationality and the fact that occult beliefs and practices are, in a way, irrational and unscientific. And you link that with a Kantian idea, with a Kantian idea of the importance of a critical metaphysics. But I'm not sure. He says it is a regression in consciousness, and
consciousness very, very tightly circumscribed. Like, he has a very specific definition of consciousness as he's using. Like, he doesn't think it's stupidity. He even doesn't even think that they're doing it on purpose. I think he refers to it as a reflex action.
Also, he talks about occultism being a decomposed monotheism, and the fact that people turn to astrology because they don't believe in God. So I think that your summary is a good one. My perception is that it tends to make his argument stronger than it actually is, to be fair, which is probably a compliment to you and not so much a compliment to him. Because it seems to me like you are summarizing and translating in philosophical terms, trying to find the roots, the philosophical roots and the ideological roots of what he is saying in this thesis.
And also, it's
Whereas,
just when he goes off the rails and he gives these anecdotes, right? Like, he does those pithy things like that actually hurt him more than help him, I think.
Yeah, but at the same time, they are still informative about what his thesis is really about. I mean, we shouldn't just select what makes more sense to make his argument stronger than it is.
Right. Or that his particular bias actually weakens his own argument. That his argument is actually better than he thinks it is. Or at least it could be better than he thinks it is. And this is often the case. That we stretch when we should just lay our argument out. Especially when we dislike something. Clearly that he dislikes occultism. And I think that's the problem, is that he's putting himself in there too much.
So, like, for instance, I am looking at the thesis now. As I said, I tend to move back and forth between your slides and the thesis, and I reflect upon them. So, for instance, the second thesis starts by saying the second mythology is more untrue than the first. And the second mythology would be occultism, which is a second mythology second to religion, to monotheism. Monotheism is what he says. Um, so he, in a way, let me see. It's like, to me, he doesn't really argue properly why that would be something that derives from monotheism. I mean, why is occultism related to monotheism, other than saying that since you don't believe in God, you believe in astrology, and
I think
so
I think he thinks of it as a decomposed religion. I think he's just conflating monotheism with religion, because that's true in the Western world in the 1940s. Basically, I mean, for 99.9% of the population. Like, I'm fairly confident in the 40s there were more atheists than polytheists in the Western world.
yeah, that makes sense.
Like, there are probably more bitheists than polytheists. Like, I think there were probably more Zoroastrians than there were polytheists in the 1940s.
Hmm.
So I think he's saying that because I think that was true in the 40s. It's less true now. But it's still, I think, more atheists than polytheists.
Hmm. Yeah, okay. I guess we can move on to the fourth one. As I said, my comment on your summarization is that I think that he makes his thesis stronger than they actually are. That is my personal take on that. No, I'm not saying that your summary is not correct and is not saying what he's saying. I'm saying that I think it makes his argument stronger because there are elements of this thesis that make his argument weaker, I think.
Yeah, and it's taking the good with the bad. But let's start at 4. Do you want to read, or you want me to read?
Um, you can read.
All right. Thesis 4. Occultism is a reflex action to the subjectification of all meaning, the complement of reification. If to the living, objective reality seems deaf as never before, then try to elicit meaning from it by saying abracadabra. Meaning is attributed indiscriminately to the next worst thing. The rationality of the real, no longer quite convincing, is replaced by hopping tables and rays from leaps of earth. The awful of the phenomenal world becomes to sick consciousness the mundus intelligibiis. It might also be speculative truth, just as Kafka's Oderdreck is also an angel and yet is in a positivity that excludes the medium of thought. Only barbaric aberration alienated from itself, subjectively mistaking itself for its object. The more consummate the inanity of what is fobbed off as spirit, and in anything less spiritless the enlightened subject would at once recognize itself. That's a really great joke, actually. The more the meaning detected there, where in fact there is none at all, becomes an unconscious, compulsive projection of a subject decomposing historically, if not clinically. It would like to make the world resemble its own decay. Therefore, it has dealings with requisites and evil wishes. The third one reads out my doom. The third one reads out my hand. She wants my doom. In occultism, the mind groans under its own spell, like someone in a nightmare whose torment grows with the feeling that he is dreaming, yet he cannot wake up. So again, he's really just
Yeah,
dripping with
he's really ranting.
yeah, I mean, he's really just, I mean, it's just sarcasm at the top of his, sarcasm turned up to 50. But there is an argument in here. So that's his argument. I'm fairly confident, right? So I think it's important to know that occultism is a reflex action. That's a really important idea, that it's a response to something. It's not
That's his
it's
perception of occultism.
for sure that it's a reflex action. It's born of a very particular kind of thing, and it's the case that it originates, and when it originates for a very particular kind of reason. And I think that again, if to the living objective reality seems deaf as never before, some good ableist language there, unfortunately. They try to elicit meaning by saying abracadabra. And I think the idea, right, is that the world is in fact unresponsive to us. That's modernity. Modernity is a world that is unresponsive to us. Pre-modernity is a world where we can make the world do things. We can pray and the world will change. We can do magic and the world will change. The modern perspective is there's nothing you can do. The world is an immutable fact. You can manipulate it, but you can't fundamentally change it. And that's alienation. That's classic alienation. That the world presents itself as something that is immutable to us. And what he says is there are a couple responses to that, right? And for him, it is very rational. The rational response to alienation is to seek out the real. That's what, when you feel alienated, you don't want to be alienated. It's bad to be alienated. So you go find what's really real. And I think what's interesting is, again, it's that he thinks that the occultic response is ironic. That the fact that the world presents itself as alien, and people want to connect to the real world. This world does not appear to be real, and people don't like it, and they try to do other things to get away from this world, or whatever. The response is to seek out the real, and occultists do that, right? And so he thinks that this is basically an acknowledgement that the real is rational, but where they fail, according to him, is that they can't accept the rational as real. This is the world, and there's nothing else. There is no other world. And for him, I think what he's arguing here is that rather than actually seek out why the world is alienating the way that it is, the material conditions which give rise to the alienation, they seek another world. But that's just typical religion, right? If that were his critique, it would be a typical critique of religion. But he thinks that the problem is that occultism does something very unique because of how it regresses in a very hypermodern context. And that regression in the hypermodern context is that the world that they create, according to him, is filled with fetishes, but fetishes that take the commodity form. And this is an interesting defense of traditional religion, and we'll see this in a minute, is that traditional religion, because it's connected to the pre-modern world, is a hedge against commodification. But a new religion isn't.
But occultism, generally speaking, is not new. We're not talking about a specific tradition here. We're talking about occultism in general. And another problem that I see with Adorno's understanding of occultism is that he keeps referring to what occultists do as something that has to do with another word, with a metaphysical word. And there is an interaction with the metaphysical word, but the concept that occultists have to deal with the supernatural is something that has been abandoned in the 20th century, from the 20th century onwards.
Right. So we can use another word rather than use the word metaphysical entities.
Yeah, but then it drops the argument against seeking a different word.
Or a dimension of this
that is less real of this one, because if the entities that occultists interact with are actually fully part of this world, they're not supernatural, they're not in another world, then it would drop the argument that that word is even less real than this one is.
World in the Husserlian sense, not world in the sense of like a different dimension, but even the sense of world, even this world populated with metaphysical entities. So, for instance, I don't know, leprechauns or something, or spirits, or ghosts, or so it doesn't necessarily entail a separate world than this one, or a natural, the distinction between supernatural and natural. It would simply be metaphysical entities of any kind. And I guess I would say more than trivial metaphysical entities. We can bookmark qualia or something like that. That's a different discussion. But I would say things like spirits or ancestors or disembodied intelligences, things like that, which could completely exist in this world. So But the idea that, for instance, one could go consult the Akashic record, that could be something that exists in the world, but he would think that it would be a metaphysically empty category or an ontologically empty category. So I use world there in the Husserlian sense. But it's the fourth point that I think is the most critical for him, right? Is that it's a problem born of alienation. That's unique to religion. That's just classic historical materialism. But it's because it emerges in this very particular modern context that it becomes because it emerges in this very modern context and in a very particular period in late capitalism, then it's more imbued or distorted, you might say, or metaphysically I don't know if the right word is corrupted or whatever, because of when it emerges under the aegis of commodity fetishism, and therefore it reproduces the least real elements of this world. And so occultists have a dual problem. The conditions that gave rise to alienation are still here. They're still out there in the world, like the market, fascism, whatever. But also now they have to menace themselves with beings that don't exist, like the ancestors or Enochian spirits or fairies or changelings or gods. So the problem redoubles upon them. They actually, I think what he's saying here is it makes the situation becomes worse. And now we have a negative feedback loop.
I guess that I can see his point, but it's just that the premise is not something that can be proven, really. There is so much in it that sometimes I get a bit lost and I have to reread it.
Yeah, he's not helping us at all. That's why I redid all these theses, because it's just he's such a but I think that last line, right? In occultism, the mind groans under its own spell, like someone in a nightmare. It's that phrase, right? It groans under its own spell. It's for him, the occultist is tormenting themselves by thinking that, and we'll get to astrology in a minute, by trying to think that that astrology is determining your life, or that spirit's telling you what to do. It's already bad enough you have a boss. Like that's bad enough. But now you have a metaphysical boss that you invented.
Yeah, but the problem is that that's his perception that they invented it, but for occultists that's not the case. It's not something that they invented. So he is in a way arguing against occultism, not from the point of view of those who believe in occultism, but from the point of view of somebody who has his own idea of occultism, as somebody outside of occultism that knows very little about occultism. Probably only what he reads in the magazines of the time.
I think he knows a good bit. I mean, I think he knows something about theosophy. We'll see that in a minute. I think he knows a bit more than we're giving him credit for. At least again, what he knows in the 40s, what's knowable in the 40s. So I think he knows something. But again, we could just sub out the word occultist and just put, any kind of any philosophical point of view that does this. He's just having to pick on he's having to pick on a particular kind of. He's just using the word occultism, but you could basically pick anyone who violates Occam's razor. And anyone who violates Occam's razor and makes the violations of Occam's razor interact with them in negative ways, or any way at all. But this would also be true of religion in a general way. But he thinks that there's a particular way it's true in occultism, in a particular way that it's true because of the situation in which it emerges, which would not have been true for, I don't know, John Dee. But John Dee had his own problems. The spirit world of that world is reconstituted along feudal lines. which is in some ways even worse.
Mm. I don't know. I guess for me, it's kind of difficult to. It's difficult to argue against it in the details, because I just think that the premise is not correct. So when we get into his argument, I think that in the details of his argument, I find it more difficult to respond in any way, because I find it so difficult to agree with the premise to begin with.
Yeah, that's then I think that goes back to thesis one, right? That basically, if you don't accept this, all all three parts of it, then none of this is going to work for you. That's why it's also why I think it's interesting that anyone would read this. Like, aside from people, or that's not true. That's also why I think it's interesting that if you don't accept these positions, basically, the rest doesn't follow. But that's just how philosophers work. I mean, they operate from axioms and theorems and propositions, and we can call it a bias, or we can call it a philosophical position. But I think it's less a bias and more a position. It's just a position that I think, Angela, you don't agree with, and probably very few people in the chat do either.
Mm.
Hence me losing the subscribers, which is interesting because people love the
Have
idea
you
that they don't.
really have you really lost
Oh yeah, I've
subscribers?
lost like 36 subscribers since we started doing this.
Mm.
You can see every episode that I look at where how many subscribers you get or lose, and each one every time I do this, I lose like somewhere between 12 and 20. People like rage quit, which is funny because it's just proof to me that there are a lot of people who like don't. Everyone says they don't want to live in an echo chamber, and then when there actually is a thing that really deeply questions what they believe, they rage quit. They they unsubscribe. They're like, I don't want to do this. And to
That's
me,
too bad.
yeah, I think it just, to me, it's like grist for the mill of like, oh yeah, we don't want to be challenged, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to do this essay, because it is, especially for left wing occultists. If you're like a right wing occultist, right, then you can just go, full blown tradition. You can be a hardcore, sort of Evolian, Guanite kind of traditionalist, and then you can just reject everything because this is just Marxist garbage for you. But what's for me, I think that there are very few of those people, I think, in this. But I think in here, we have a huge combination of people who are both left-wing and occultists. And what Adorno is saying is you can't do both. And if by left-wing, you mean sort of in the Marxist world of the left-wing, like some kind of in the relationship of historical materialism, which is interesting because that's the methodology I use on the channel. Esoterica is a historical materialist channel.
Mm.
So,
Well, as you know, I'm not a historical materialist. I can use historical materialism in yeah, I do that in some of my scripts, but my scripts are, I mean, my videos are based on peer-reviewed sources. So when the scholar has used historical materialism, that will be the methodological angle, and when that is not the case, then it will not be the case. So it also depends on what the angle of the papers that I've selected have taken.
have you come
But
across any papers that use historical that are people who are historical materialists?
Hanegraaff?
No, Hanegraaff. He's a historicist, but I think he's sort of a classic positivist historian. He's definitely not. No, he's definitely not a Marxist. I think he's just a good old fashioned, like, how it really was.
I do know Marxists who are in academia, but I don't think that they use historical materialism in their research. There's an Italian colleague of mine, he also works on contemporary occult practices, and he uses anthropological methodologies. I don't know. Do you think that you can be historical materialist and an anthropologist at the same time?
Oh yeah, the most famous. What is it? What is it called? The school of what is that school called? Historical. Sorry, one of the most famous anthropological textbooks of all time. Like the guy that was like, if we want to understand a culture, we have to understand where every single one of its calories comes from. What is the name of that school? I can't remember what it's called. But yeah, there's like a really famous, historical materialist. I won't Google Scholar. Sorry, hold on. I want to find the name of this school. No. Is it cultural materialism? Does that sound right? Yeah, that's it. The name of the really famous textbook that did it. Like the emic idics distinction all comes from cultural materialism. But yeah, The Rise of Anthropological Theory, is that the big book? Yeah, Marvin Harris and the 1968 The Rise of Anthropological Theory basically developed, and then he developed it further in cultural materialism. Oh yeah, there are definitely folks out there doing that work.
Yeah, then I'm not sure. Are you familiar with any academics who are historical materialists and work on esotericism? I mean,
basically none.
Do you think that that's because it's not
I think because
a viable methodology for studying
I think it's because 75% of the people working on Western esotericism are esotericists.
No,
I think it has.
don't think it's true.
I mean, I would say that there's a significant plurality, and if you believe that, if you're definitely not going to be doing historical materialism, you cannot be a historical materialist and be believing in, Enochian spirits or whatever. So no, I think it's a unique. There are historical materialists who work in religion, but I think that it's a unique. It's the public secret of Western esotericism studies that a significant chunk of its scholars are in the broom closet, and so in that case, that's unsurprising. You're going to see very little historical materialists. I would be willing to argue I'm probably the only one.
And
or one of the few.
may I suggest that perhaps historical materialism might not be the best way to understand Western historicism, and that's why it's not used as much.
It could be,
or at all.
I mean, that could be the case.
You know that I think that historical materialism is, what's the term? The dirty word that you called it last time. Not an oversimplification, but a reductionist. Yeah, it is a reductionist approach. And I think that in order to understand esotericism, applying a reductionist approach is probably the the least useful way to approach and understand esotericism. And I don't think that has to do with whether you are an esotericist or not. It is just looking at what esotericism is. I guess that as a historical materialist, it could be more useful to understand the effect, perhaps, or the material causes and effects of esotericism.
That's all I do. I mean, I and it also makes me. I'm as a historical materialist, I'm agnostic about the claims made by occultists or by historical occultists. I don't think they're true, but I don't really care. For me, it's about doing history, not about diagnosing their faults. Or if I believe Agrippa's wrong about his metaphysics, then that's a philosophical argument I can have with him. But I'm doing history. I'm just doing history. But it's history ground in why would Agrippa be writing this at this time, etc. Why is he prosecuted? Why is he not prosecuted? But all the women were. I mean, but no, I think
Mhm.
historical materialism is actually very powerful precisely because of its reductionism. And again, I'm very I'm a proud reductionist. I don't know. This is like we said before, it's one of these really weird, dirty words that I know people. It's like in religious studies. I remember being in religious studies in graduate school and in undergraduate. People just like, that's reductionistic, and I'm like, yeah, that's a compliment for me. Reductionism
Well,
is is the most successful theory in the history of theories, basically.
well, yeah, of course, if you narrow it down to almost nothing or to something so small, then you can feel comfortable that you got it right, but you still haven't got the full picture.
I mean, I think that you can, as far as like academic methodologies go, that I mean, it definitely means that we remain within the world of the world.
The physicality, not the words. See, you're being reductionist even in the way you explain historical materialism.
Yeah, but
You're saying we are just sticking with the reality, with the word, but these are statements that are very reductionist, because what
mhm.
is reality and what is the word? If you are defining reality only by the things that you can measure and see with your five senses, or not even that, I think, because you are not a phenomenologist, so it's even more
That's
reductionist
yeah.
than that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we don't play ball with phenomenologists either. I mean, again, but that's what I mean. Could you get a peer review paper in with like your with
So,
unverified personal gnosis? Like I saw it and
um,
I heard it in a dream.
well, if you study anthropologically, I actually I don't know if it's gonna get accepted, but I proposed a paper at the American Academy of Religion on understanding the concepts of unverified personal gnosis and verified personal gnosis. But it is not a matter of obviously, as an anthropologist, I don't try to prove whether it's right or wrong. I'm just trying to understand how people articulate that and how that creates meaning in their life and how it's reshaping practice and all of
For
that
sure.
stuff. But
But you couldn't submit a paper that was your own, like you had a vision
my
and then you
own, no, of
yeah,
course
that's what I'm
not.
saying. Like we just it's just that's just academic rigor. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what like
But
we
academic rigor is not, I wouldn't argue that it is reductionist. I think that it is, first of all, what the methods that we use in academia change all the time, depending on what allows us to get the most accurate knowledge at a given time. And that changes all the time. And it changes also because, and that is my opinion, because knowledge is a moving target. So I'm the opposite of a historical materialist, because I think that even what we have in front of us changes all the time.
I mean,
So
that could be true, but it would still be the case that, that if you want to publish a paper, then there have to be evidentiary standards, and it just
yeah,
happens to be
sure.
that, and those evidentiary standards are very much in agreement, I think, with historical materialist methods. And
Um,
again, for me on the channel, like I'm doing a 45-minute deep dive into a fourth century Gnostic text. I don't have to believe it's true, but I have to understand it. And and I don't have to like pass judgment on it, at least as a scholar. Now, if someone asked
yeah,
me
sure.
philosophically, do I believe that these are handbooks for how to get to eternity? I would say no, I don't believe that. There's no evidence for that. But in terms of producing knowledge, I mean,
Yeah,
that's why I
sure.
think I think that's why most people, you wouldn't even know that there is a methodological position at work in my content creation.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also on the matter of the fact that there are many or any, I don't know. I have now I'm curious to know whether there are scholars in historicism that use historical materialism. But even though it might be, I would suggest, obviously you don't agree, that the reason is because perhaps that's not the most useful methodology to understand aestheticism. But I would still argue for to have historical materialist approach in the study of aestheticism, just because I think the more perspectives and the more methodological perspectives we can have, the better. Exactly, because I'm not a reductionist, and so I want to see all the methodologies applied, and I want to see all the results from all of that.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I mean, let a thousand flowers blossom.
So I'm not against using historical materialists, but I wouldn't, uh, I wouldn't just stick with that and not experiment with other ways of looking at things.
Yeah, I'm happy to read papers from phenomenologists. I mean, they're tiresome, but I'll read them. I had to take whole seminars in phenomenology. It was very tiresome. But yeah, I'm perfectly happy if someone wants to take a phenomenological approach. I'm like, sure, great. I mean, it makes for long books when you pick up the Heideggerian approaches like Elliot Wolfson and write these long ass books on Kabbalah. I'm like, man, it's good for academics to take a Heideggerian perspective. It makes your books 6 times longer than they might be otherwise. So that's good. Good, good job, Skitty. Also, some folks are saying that reductionism and the study of like dynamic systems theory and emergent behavior, that's very much like if you read Plekhanov basically predicted, described what we now refer to as emergent behavior in the 1920s. So it's completely compatible with theories of reductionism. I mean, again, because things have to emerge out of something. Like emergentism is not a disproof of reductionism; it is proof of reductionism. Because emergentism means that things have to emerge from something. Simply because 2 water molecules have the property of being wet while one of them can't, that the emergence of wetness is emerging from something, specifically water molecules. So yeah, I don't know why that's often thought as like dynamic system theory as a rebuttal to against reductionism and against materialism, but
I don't know enough about emergent behavior, but I'd love to have my patron Dave here now because he's he works on that on AI and for his job and about emergent behavior and the new research, and so I don't know enough about it to argue whether it is in line with historical materialism or not. But what you're saying makes sense in terms of emergence is in a way very materialistic, the way it is, the way in my understanding, the way it is conceived is not like the development of consciousness. That at least that's my understanding, but as I said, I had limited knowledge about it.
right. And also I find that a lot of people, when they use terms like emergentism, are just waving their hands because they don't know it's just we don't know why it does that. And so I'm very very slow to say something is emergent, as opposed to being like, yeah, that has properties that we don't know. Also, when people say that things like wetness is an emergent property, I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure that's like classic category error. Wetness is a adjective that doesn't actually correspond to an actual condition. I don't know. I think that's like a failure of medieval philosophy. But can we do thesis 5 before we wrap up?
Okay.
All right. Do you want to read it? I can watch your blood pressure go up as you read.
Well, that would be good because I suffer from low blood pressure. So
oh, that would help you. Yeah. So you just need to read more Adorno.
Yes.
It's like I had low blood pressure, and then I read Adorno every day for the rest of my life, and I'm fine now.
Yes. So let's be zen about this. Angela, you can do this. The power of occultism, as of fascism, to which it is connected by thought patterns of the ilk of anti-Semitism, is not only pathic. What does pathic means?
I think he means like not only pathic in the sense of pathological, not pathic in the sense of emotional. I think pathic in the sense of pathic and like sociopathic, like in the bad sense.
I thought that my version was had a typo to be fair, but I wasn't familiar with the term anyway. Rather, it lies in the fact that in the lesser panaceas, as in superimposed pictures, consciousness famished for truth imagines it is grasping a dimly present knowledge diligently denied to it by official progress in all its forms. It is the knowledge that society, by virtually excluding the possibility of spontaneous change, is gravitating towards total catastrophe. The real absurdity is reproduced in the astrological hocus pocus. That's always kind of him to insult while he's trying to be clever and not succeeding, which adduces the impenetrable connections of alienated elements, nothing more alien than the stars. Well, who says that? Of course you do. But that's not an argument that some people that believe in astrology would endorse as knowledge about the subject. The menace deciphered in the constellations resembles the historical threat that propagates itself precisely through unconsciousness, absence of subject. That all are prospective victims of a whole made up solely of themselves. They can only make bearable by transferring that whole to something similar but external. In the hopeful idiocy they practice, their empty horror, they are able to vent their impractical woe, their crass fear of death, and yet continue to repress it, as they must if they wish to go on living. The breaking the line of life that indicates a lurking cancer is a fraud only in the place where it purports to be found, the individual's hand. Where they refrain from diagnosis in the collective, it would be correct. Occultists rightly feel drawn towards childishly monstrous scientific fantasies. That's nice. The confusion they saw between their emanations and the isotopes of uranium is ultimate clarity. The mystical rays are modest anticipations of technical ones. Superstition is knowledge because it sees together the ciphers of destruction scattered on the social surface. It is folly because, in all its death wish, it still clings to illusions, expecting from the transfigured shape of society misplaced in the skies an answer that only a study of real society can give.
I wanted you to read. You got to read that one because of your recent episode on astrology.
Yeah.
Since he picks on astrology here.
Have you watched it?
I have watched it briefly. Yeah, I watched it, like picked through it. I need to go back and rewatch. Thursday nights are my watch all my YouTube people nights. So tonight we'll work through it.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I was reading it slowly, but it is partly because I find it hard to read,
No.
and partly because I have to keep my screen at a very bizarre angle to be seen the way people see me, and so it's a bit more difficult to read things because of that. But
Also, you're reading in, like you're obviously English is. People forget sometimes that English is a second language for you, and Adorno's English is incredibly hard. So I'm again always I'm always just like so impressed by anyone who's like, for us Americans who are all monolingual people, or most of us are, like when people work in a second language and they work on something that's impenetrable, like damn Adorno, it's always super impressive to me.
Thank you.
And it's clear in the German, but that's such a what's the right word? Such a pompous thing to say, but it is clear a bit in the German. All right. So I can try to unpack this and see what I think his argument is, but I think his argument goes like this. So we've diagnosed, right, what he thinks is going on here. That is to say, the subjective pre-critical metaphysics is born of alienation. But he's arguing that because it's born of alienation in the specific case of late capitalism, that it produces thought forms that are specifically conspiratorial in nature, which is to say, the commodity strikes us as alien and therefore frightening and bad, because it is frightening and bad. And when we project it into a hyper reality or another reality, ever how we want, a supernatural world or a metaphysical world, it also frightens us. It also strikes us as negative, and therefore that develops a conspiratorial kind of thought form fundamentally. And what he links right here is fascism, and we'll come back to that in a minute, because he thinks that, again, the regression in thought he's thinking of here is fascism, of which occultism he thinks is a particular symptom. And so his argument is that when the world strikes us as alien, and when these other entities strike us as alien or foreign to us, this inverts social causal mechanisms. That is to say, there's an ironic move where things that actually have no power over us whatsoever, spirits or ancestors or stars or whatever, tradition for that matter, that when we do that, right, when we have these kind of ideas that things that have no impact on us whatsoever, like stars or ancestors or spirit, the inversion is that makes us not believe that the things that do actually have impact on us do, which is, of course, for him, the social forces and organizations of production. So this inverts reality for him, that the stars, which are completely alien to us and have no effect on us, now have a huge effect on us, even despite the fact they don't. And what really has an effect on us, like the stock market, which again is completely unreal, gets ignored. I think I've said this before, that that a single shareholder can flex and blink and do more damage than every Enochian spirit combined. I double dog dare the Enochian spirit to do more damage than Elon Musk. I think he's more powerful than he has more power in his pinky in a tweet than he does than all the spirits combined. And what he notices about that is, and I think this is really interesting, and I think he's not wrong about this, is that because occultism has this particular trait, it generates a comorbidity, and that comorbidity is conspiracy theory. And one of the things that's interesting, right, that one of the things that fascism and occultism share is a unique history of anti-Semitism, like a shared history, a deep shared history of anti-Semitism, whether it's theosophy or Aleister Crowley or like Christian mysticism. It is shocking how almost all of them share some degree of anti-Semitism, and that's what fascism also shares with it. And so that link is not accidental.
Is it something that pertains to occultism, or was it just a moment in history? Because at the moment, occultism is very much left leaning. Of course, there are occultists that are more right wing,
Right.
but for instance, paganism is for the most part quite left leaning and not anti-Semitist, I wouldn't say.
So there's certainly exceptions, but I would say organized occultism in the 20th century was significantly influenced, unfortunately, by anti-Semitism from
Yeah,
like
but
theosophy and
yeah,
like.
but I guess my question, yeah, I agree with you. Totally agree with you with that. I guess that my question is that is that a feature of occultism, or is it because occultism at that specific time was influenced by that specific time period and the zeitgeist?
I think he thinks it's not unique to occultism, but occultism suffers from it specifically. For instance, also I think that anti-Semitism is just a general version of conspiracy theory, and it is, to me, interesting how often occultism and the conspiracy theory world overlap, and that's grist for his mill. That they're born of a shared irrationalism, like the amount of occulty people during COVID who were anti-vaxxers. The anti-vax movement
There was a specific type of occultist, though, like the theosophist would be, within that camp. But I think that the problem is that you're lumping together so many different traditions in one category, and that is not the case. I agree with you that there is part of occultism that can overlap with conspiracy theories, but there's also a huge chunk of what can be considered occultism that doesn't at all, like in the slightest. And in fact, they tend to be very influenced and interested in academic research and science.
Sure. And so it's, I think he would say, is the exception that proves the rule. Like we don't. I don't.
It's a
I'd be
big
curious to.
exception. It's a big exception
I'd be
to be
curious to.
considered an exception.
I mean, I'd be curious to know what among occultists and the New Age movement, because the New Age movement is shockingly penetrated with all kinds of conspiracy theory stuff. Like, if you take that movement and compare it as a percent of the population and a mainstream religion like Catholicism, and see what percent of Catholicism or Judaism or whatever, what percent of those people subscribe to conspiracy theories, and then check the same thing on occultism and see what percent of the religion subscribes to them, I think I would take the Pepsi challenge and argue that in the occult milieu, which I would group the New Age movement, um, paganism, neo-paganism, Kabbalah, all that stuff, I would be willing to argue, and I would put it as a supposition. It would be interesting to check that I bet conspiracy theories are more of a problem in those
So,
circles than the mainstream big religions.
so, okay, I can answer to that to an extent. I interviewed on my channel David Robertson, who has worked and published on conspiracy theories. And so, if people are interested, they can look at that interview because I asked specifically about that and what emerged in his research with in relation to paganism and belief in magic. And even though there seem to be people that hold both beliefs, but there are also people from all walks of life or religious life that are conspiracy theorists. And anecdotally, looking, for instance, at the Italian context and what happened during COVID, there were a huge number of Catholics that were conspiracy theorists. Even from my home city and other, neighboring cities in southern Italy, there were so many Catholics that were conspiracy theorists. So I think that, for instance, during COVID, I personally don't think so, but obviously we would need a sociological study to verify that. I would be interested in interviewing Joanna Parmigiani at Harvard University because I know that she has worked recently and published on conspirituality. So that would be interesting to investigate. When spirituality and conspiracy theories go together. But I think that to assume or to imply that within the occult milieu you have a higher percentage of conspiracy theories, that's I don't think that that's true, but
Yeah, yeah. I
I
don't know
don't
that.
I don't have data to back that up, but my perception is that that is not true because I've my experience with occultists have ranged from Thelema to paganism. For instance, within the pagan community, you don't find many conspiracy theories. You find more of those within the New Age movement, within, for instance, the uh, theosophy, anthroposophy, um, Christian mystics. Also, I would say they are more inclined towards conspiracy theories that pagans, Thelemites, and other occultists are. That is my anecdotal perception. So obviously, we would need sociological
Yeah, we would
data
need. Yeah,
to.
we need data. I kind of have the. Yeah, I guess I have the opposite suspicion. I think it would tick higher, and I think it would tick higher for a reason similar to what he's saying, is that people become occultists primarily out of alienation. That's his argument, that they become alienated from, for instance, the traditional religion they grew up in, and they go looking for the truth, whatever the truth is, and they subscribe to occult beliefs in the part of that. I think that suspicion actually he thinks is a good. That's actually a very healthy thing, right? Like that. That's the reaction, the reflex reaction that he thinks is correct. That the actual rational response to alienation is to go looking for what's really real. He thinks the argument, though, that the problem is that they don't find what's really real. They end up creating an alternate reality that isn't real at all. In fact, it's worse in some ways. But his argument is that the very impulse also is comorbid with the kind of irrationalities that give rise to fascism, which is basically a conspiracy theory. Anti-Semitism is basically a conspiracy theory. And the second thing, the last thing he says, right, is that that because occultism is for him fundamentally a subjective thought form, which is to say it's about what individual people think, not what is true objectively. right? It's about subjective truth and subjective experiences. And because it's so focused on the subjective, that the objective basically has to come to serve the objective. And that means pseudoscience runs wild too. That's the last thing he says, right? That the whole business about monstrous scientific fantasies that they see emanations were the isotopes of uranium and blah 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 blah. That for him, he just says that pre-modern religion had a dialectical relationship between subject and object. Enlightenment relations were subject-object domination. For him, given liberalism and late capitalism, which were all individual consumers and individual people with individual rights, the subject dominates the object, and the object must serve the subject, and therefore you get all these, like, for him, he thinks I think it results in widespread pseudoscience. And like I will say, at least for my channel, the amount of pseudoscience that I have to delete off my channel, like, boggles my mind. Like the amount of people that believe that quantum theory proves something about their metaphysical beliefs is like boggles my mind. Like that, I hear that stuff constantly. And that, you know, I think that is an aspect that does trouble me deeply. Where like objective truth, scientific truth that we've now firmly, you know, quantum theory is the most it's the most empirically verified theory in the history of the world, comes to serve nonsense metaphysical beliefs, as if spooky action distance proves magic or something, which there's absolutely no reason to believe that. There's no reason to believe that spooky action distance is even happening. We can totally take a Bohmian analysis of that, and we don't really need to have spooky action at distance. But that's the last argument. The last part of this argument is that it results in conspiratorial thinking, which is dangerous, and it results in pseudoscience, which is also dangerous.
I would say that that is possible, that I can lead to those things, but I don't think that it is something that is specific to occultism. So maybe in my case, when I agree with Adorno and the critics that he moves to occultism, the specific critics that I agree with, I don't think that they are specific to occultism. I think that there are many other cultural phenomena that can produce the same effect, and I don't find it to be something that is peculiar and specific to occultism. It can be found in occultism, but it can be found in other cultural and religious phenomena as well.
That's definitely true, but I think that he's at least saying it's uniquely bad here, and maybe he's even saying that when you find it elsewhere, it's actually just another form of occultism out there. So that's just what he's defining it for right or wrong. But I think I think we're buried in whatever number 5. This is what he's cashing out of it. I think this is his real worry, that occultism and fascism share in common an irrationalism, a very modern irrationalism. And 2 of the results of it are conspiratorial thinking, which anti-Semitism, of course, is a form of that. And of course, most fascisms use some form of conspiratorial thinking, whether it's the immigrants or the Jews or the Freemasons or something.
I think that there are many political views that use conspiratorial thinking or populist thinking.
For sure, and populist thinking is just on the road to fascism usually anyway. Typically they're just fascists in disguise or they just don't know they are until, you know, they get power and do what they want.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about Brexit too. You know, that was also conspiratorial, and in the way it was formulated and presented, and people who, for the most part, were not occultists still voted it. So
right. So it's that his argument is not that all conspiratorial thinking is related to occultism, but rather occultism uniquely suffers from this. It uniquely suffers from this trifecta.
I disagree, but I can see why he would think that in the 1940s, because in the 1940s you have some quite prevalent occultists that were fascist.
I mean, which ones weren't?
Yeah, I mean,
which ones weren't like basically Nazis? I mean, from Aleister Crowley to the Theosophical Society to, esoteric Hitlerism.
Yeah, yeah. I think that it makes sense for him to think that. I don't think it is true now, but it makes sense that he would think that at that specific time in history, because, but as I said, I don't think, even in that case, I think that occultism has its own unique traits, but it is also part of the historical time and the cultural time that are going on at any given time. So I would say that, for instance, today occultism tends to be, of course, there are also right-wing people within occultism, but for the most part I would say that it tends to excuse more left than right, for instance,
certainly paganism
nowadays.
does, I would say.
Paganism does, definitely.
Right.
But I think, even in heathenry, that is often seen as more right wing, but there are so many left leaning people in heathenry that are trying to defend them against against folkism,
Sure.
folkism, sorry, and folkish type of heathens. So I don't know.
Ooh,
That would be another interesting sociological study to to do, the political. But from what I've seen in Italy and what I've seen in the UK, I my experience, and this is anecdotal as well because we don't have sociological data, but most people within the occult community are left wing now. But I wouldn't be surprised if in the 1940s and it was the opposite. And
right.
that is because to an extent, probably to a considerable extent, occultism is also um, a product of its time. So at any given time in history, it will be influenced by what's going on in the world and in the
Angela, that sounds
politics.
dangerously close to historical materialism.
But I'm not the reductionist, so it's I don't exclude that perspective. I include it in something wider that also encompasses more than the historical materialist perspective.
Okay, do you want to do the sixth one? The sixth one's easy. This is the easiest one of all of them. I know we're at an hour and a half, but if we do the sixth one, then we have like one more session, I think, and we'll wrap this up. I can read it quickly, and it'll be easy to do.
Okay, then you can
All
read
right.
it.
All right. Last one. Occultism is the metaphysics of dunces. This is really a slander against dunces. Duns Scotus people. The mediocrity of the mediums is no more accidental than the apocryphal triviality of the revelations. Since the early days of spiritualism, the beyond has conveyed nothing more significant than the dead grandmother's greetings and the prophecy of an imminent journey. The excuse that the world of spirits can convey is no more to poor human reason than the latter can take it in, is equally absurd, an auxiliary hypothesis of the paranoid system. The lumen naturale, the light of reason, has, after all, taken us somewhat further than the journey to grandmother. And if the spirits do not wish to acknowledge this, they are ill-mannered hobgoblins with whom it is better to break off dealings. The platitudinously natural content of the supernatural message betrays its untruth. In pursuing yonder what they have lost, they encounter only the nothing they have. It's a great turn of phrase. In order not to lose touch with the everyday dreariness in which, as irredeemable realists, they are at home, they adapt the meaning they revel in to the meaningless they flee. The worthless magic is nothing other than the worthless existence it lights up. This is what makes the prosaic so cozy. Facts which differ from this are only the case by not being facts as trumped up as a fourth dimension. Their non-being alone is their qualitas occulta. They supply simpletons with a world outlook. With their blunt, drastic answers to every question, the astrologers and spiritualists do not so much solve problems as remove them by crude premises from all possibility of solutions. Their sublime realm, conceived as analogous to space, no more needs to be thought than chairs and flower vases. It thus reinforces conformism. Nothing better pleases what is there than what should be, as such, be meaning. All right. So this is there's not much going on in this one, actually. Frankly, he's just spewing invective most of the time. And his argument, I think, is
And then you
this.
wonder why people hate him.
Yeah, I know. I never wondered why people hate him. I just wondered why people disagree with him. That's very different. His argument here, right, is that basically, despite the claims of occult knowledge, right, speaking to ghosts or spirits or gods or whatever, occultists claim to have access to capital T truths, right? Whether it's the Akashic record or whatever. But yet, for more than a century, they have not produced anything other, in his opinion, than platitudes, unverifiable claims, or just nonsense masquerading as spiritual philosophical depth. So basically what he's saying is occultists claim to have access to a world of fundamental truth and yet have produced nothing. They've produced nothing in terms of anything other than like platitudes, like everything is one or something. And this is what I sometimes call my Enochian collapse conjecture threshold. Sometimes people will tell me things like, yeah, I talked to the Enochian spirits. And I'm like, okay, that's fantastic. Or I've scribed the aethers. I'm like, that's great. Scribe the aethers. And I'm like, and they're like, well, the Enochian spirits tell me stuff. Why don't you believe me? It's like, I don't disbelieve that they're telling you things. You might be experiencing that. But if you want to get my attention, give me an Enochian spirit to solve the collapse conjecture. That's my threshold. Like, if a spirit or an ancestor or a god just solves the collapse conjecture, gives us a proof for the collapse conjecture, if they do that, you've crossed my threshold and now I'm listening. You have my undivided attention. But until then, you don't have my undivided attention. And so his argument is that it's produced no truths about the objective world whatsoever, and rather it generates data which does more to reflect the subjective conditions of the creators more than anything else. So we learn more about theosophists from them telling us what's in the Akashic record than we learn about what's in the actual Akashic record. So, and then again, the comeback here, of course, would be, oh, it produces meaning or happiness or enjoyment, or I get meaning out of it, or I have experiences of spirits talking to me. And of course, what Adorno is going to say is no, because the very underlying conditions which are giving rise to this are ideological. And so, at the fundamental level, you're going to repeat back the ideological thought forms that give rise to the world of the spirits that are talking to you in the first place. So his argument is that for more than a century, I guess in his mind, he's just saying, for more than a century, we've had thousands of people talking to these things, and they've not produced a single piece of objectively real information. And what they have produced is platitudes or experiences, but again, those are unverified personal gnosis.
Well, on that I have my ideas, obviously. So, in a way, I agree, and in a way, I disagree, because and probably there are colleagues that would disagree with me with that, because there are scholars in historicism, even now currently, that want to actually prove the fact that magic has an objective effect on reality. I tend to be a bit skeptical about that, just because my impression is that magic works in a way that is different from how the physical world works, and it tends to move more through acausal connections as opposed to causal connections. The fact that whether magic causes objective changes in reality or not, well, this is not something that I have data to say that it is correct. I can say that many practitioners report that as a result of magic workings, things will change. The thing is that magic works in ways that are very different from how the physical world works. You will still get changes in the physical world, but they will happen in ways that are sometimes unexpected. So when you do a successful magic rituals, as practitioners report, you will get the desired effect, but you cannot control how it will happen. It will happen, but you cannot control how. So that is why it eludes the scientific method as it is now. Although, as I said, there are scholars currently that are trying to, create. They are working on doing experiments in that respect. So we're gonna see in the next few years what happens. Maybe I will be proven wrong in that, but my perception is that magic works acausally and in a way that is not the same as how the physical work works, and that practitioners report that it is effective. So when we talk about objective changes in reality, again, if we start from Adorno's premises, I can understand his argument. But for instance, I don't think that there is an objective reality. So I think that there is an intersubjective reality, which is different, even though it can be probably similar to, or it's the closest thing to objectivity that we can get without the absolutism that objectivity brings about and brings to the table. So since I don't really believe in the concept of objectivity, then this claim that magic is not real because it doesn't produce objective results, for me, is not an argument that stands, because then you have to prove to me that reality is objective to begin with, and that is not something that you can prove either. I don't think nobody can prove to me that I exist, for instance. The things that you can prove are still within a very specific set of premises. Even when we talk about how natural scientific methods work, they are still working within a specific paradigm.
So I guess the question would be, using any paradigm you would want, what would be an experiment that would disprove the existence of the ability of magic to do things acausally?
So you mean that magic then follows the laws of cause and effect that we have in the physical world?
Or any theory of cause and effect. Like, I'm not sure what I'm not quite sure, frankly, what acausal means, because that just means not causing something, but that can't be what it means. But I mean, there's
Acausal.
non-linear,
Yeah,
like
it is something that I briefly talk about in my latest video on astrology, and Wolfgang Pauli and Jung. So when we see the physical world and we try to understand the physical world, one of the foundational elements of how we understand the physical world, and even through some natural science, is by cause and effect. So, for instance, a famous tenet in natural science is correlation is not causation. When two things happen at the same time, it doesn't mean that one has caused the other. So, one of the aims of natural science, in most cases, is to find the cause, not just the correlations. Whereas in magic, and this is something that you find in Jung and you find, in Pauli, and uh, you also have the possibility that there are things that happen in an acausal manner, which means that they happen simultaneously and they are not linked by cause and effect, they are linked by meaning. So meaning is what links them together and what allows them to occur at the same time. So you still have a co-occurrence of things that can happen over and over. They're just not linked by cause and effect. So my perception is that, but as I said, there are scholars in esotericism, even now at the moment that I have, that I'm working with, that they think otherwise. But my perception is that it would be extremely difficult to prove magic scientifically, to use, the common parlance, which is probably not particularly descriptive. But it is extremely difficult because of that, because I think that magic acts in a very different way than how things occur in the physical world, and the way the natural scientific method is tailored to study things. I don't think that it is the most useful way. It is not really pertinent to studying the way magic works, which tends to be a bit more acausal rather than causal, and that kind of changes the game.
Right, but it's a particularly strange use of the term causal, because if they're linked by meaning and meaning alone, i.e., there is no
Not just
causal.
meaning alone, but meaning is a great deal of their link.
So if they're linked with by something further than meaning, then that can be tested for sure. But certainly meaning can't be tested because that's a subjective. That's yeah, that's with if there were no subjectivities in the universe, then that would mean that magic would cease to exist.
Um,
Assuming that what's happening there is that what you have is correlation bridged by meaning. Assuming that subjectivities were out of the universe, there would be no magic.
um, it depends. In subjectivity, do you also include things? Or do you only, when you talk about subjectivity, do you only refer to human beings?
Any subjectivity,
Okay, then I can agree.
any subjects at all. I mean, I'm not sure what's capable of having. I mean, I'm not sure I believe in subjectivity, but anything that provisionally could have subjectivity. I think non-human animals, maybe. I don't know, but yeah, but that's a very strange definition of cause. It's a somewhat deceptive sense of cause.
What do you mean?
That in the sense that it's using cause in a very loose way. Because giving something meaning isn't causing anything, aside from a subjective state, I suppose.
Well, it's not causing. It's a matter of things that co-occur. That's
Right,
the that's the that's the thing we are talking about.
right. Yeah, I guess that would be. I mean, it's in the realm of aesthetics or propositional logic more in metaphysics then. But I mean, I guess I'll go back to Adorno, with some exceptions, right? There are a couple of cases in parapsychology that have produced some interesting greater than chance things. There's a great paper about that actually. Um, but none of this stuff, BSP, telekinesis, far reading, like far vision, these kinds of things, they produced, despite rigorous testing, no statistically greater than chance outcomes, with some exceptions. And I think that's what Adorno is saying, is that when we go to people and learn about the spirit world looks a lot like our world in many cases. That the Goetia is ruled by a bunch of dukes and lords and barons, and it's unsurprising that's what ruled their world, and that the supernatural or other or whatever world, the world of gnosis or whatever, his argument is that if it were capable of producing truths, especially something like the Akashic record, which should have every truth in there, it's conspicuous that it's not produced anything along those lines. It can produce all kinds of other things, and it does perhaps. But for me, and I think for Adorno, if someone could scry the ethers and solve the Collatz conjecture, that would be really, I mean, that will cause my ears to perk up.
Hmm.
And that's
Yeah,
the stuff that
maybe
he's
we
worried
can
about.
maybe we can see that one day. Although, why would an Enochian angel want to solve that?
It would already be, I mean, any smart, I mean, we've already solved it for some integers, but I mean, I can imagine that if there are entities that are smarter than us by leaps and bounds, then it would be easy for them to, like, I mean, just give us a solution for, is supersymmetry real, and give us a proof for whether it's real or not. And if it's not real, give us proof that it's not real. There are these problems. I mean, the problems that we face in our world, even the most advanced problems in physics, should be really easy to solve for beings that are eternal or really smart or have access to the Akashic record or, angels. I don't know. Hell, I even take a demon if they can, like, tell us how to build a fusion reactor that, just tell us how to build one that works. I mean, I would trade all of everything a spiritualist said about the afterlife for a fusion reactor.
Because you're a materialist.
Because it would keep people from starving. It would prevent wars.
That's important, of course, but providing meaning is also important. It's necessary to have a functioning body that doesn't get killed and gets cured, but you also need a reason to wake up from your bed and live your life. Otherwise, you will have a lot of safe, healthy people that are depressed and don't function just the same.
Sure, and I think he's not opposed to meaning, but I think what he's worried about is that the meaning that they're getting from this is false meaning. No,
Yeah,
again,
I don't
that's
agree.
no, I'm sure you don't. But he would say that it's inherently false because it's not a real world. It's a made up world full of commodities because it's a copy of this world at some level. And I say world again, I'm using in the Husserlian sense.
I don't agree with any of those statements, to be fair. So,
well, if anyone out there is scrying the ethers anytime soon or talking to your holy guardian angel, please have them contact me and let's solve the collapse. Again, I use the collapse conjecture because it's just a famous and it's a famous thing that should be really easy to solve and isn't. But for an angel, it should be super easy to solve. Or if you guys have access to the Akashic record, and also what's interesting to me is not only does the Akashic record often tend to produce data that isn't lined up with science, it tends to produce hyper unscientific data that's crazy.
Like well, I honestly, I'm not going to defend the Akashic record. So,
I mean, I think it's just as likely as anything else. It just happens that every time anyone goes to the Akashic record, it's just about like Aryans from Atlantis, and I'm like, oh god.
You do have a high degree of conspiracy with things that are strongly connected to theosophy, I think.
I mean, considering it's the largest, I mean, I would say the New Age movement too. Like the
New Age
yoga,
but New Age, I think, was so theosophy was extremely influential in the formation of the New Age. I think there are so many things that come from theosophy, and people don't even realize that because theosophy is not as famous as other things.
Right. They were more like they had a longer term vision than what they were up to. I mean, Crowley also tried to have a long term vision too with the OTO, but and the AA, but the Theosophists really were playing the long. I mean, they were here for tens of thousands of years, so of course, 100 years, a drop in the bucket. They're reincarnated souls from 50,000 years ago in Atlantis or whatever. But again, I think that's a point that grist for Adorno's mill. That really, it's just white people from Atlantis. That's the myth. That's the great truth. And
I'm not gonna defend that either, but I don't think that is representative of occultism more generally. Just to put that out there.
I would say that, except for like the largest esotericism channel on YouTube is Robert Seffer, and he peddles it. Yeah, Robert Seffer. He peddles that stuff.
I don't think that I'm familiar.
Yeah, thank God. He ripped me off once, and I had to get one of his videos taken down. Robert Seffer has the 2 largest esotericism channels on YouTube, and they actively peddle that white people from Atlantis stuff. And so it's one of those things where we can sort of joke about Adorno and say Adorno's wrong, but the proof of the pudding's in the tasting, and it's unsurprising that it's exactly that kind of insanity that dominates YouTube, which is the second largest search engine on the planet.
I'm not sure that I agree with that. I think that people like things that are shocking and controversial and that are different from the norm sometimes. But again, I don't think that there is necessarily something unique to occultism, and especially a specific type of occultism. I think as the post-truth has demonstrated, you find that in politics as well, that the most gripping narrative wins over facts. So I don't think there is something unique about aestheticism. I think that more generally, our society has grown less educated and more um, emotional in terms of um, being led more by emotional, gripping narratives as opposed to facts.
Well,
But
I
I
think that
think
was
that
true of the
that's
40s too. I mean, that's fascism, right?
yeah.
I mean,
But
if you
I
listen to
think
Hitler's
I think
speeches,
that
they're just a rant. There's no argument there, but they
But
work.
I think that it is something that we need to address with education and with, in a way, encouraging people to have critical thinking and critical analysis and not hold polarized thought. But again, I think that even though there are these aspects in occultism, definitely, I don't think that these are unique to occultism or specific to occultism. I think that you find them at large in our society. And since they are part of our society, then of course you will also find them in occultism, but they are not unique to occultism, I don't
Right. Well,
think.
that element is not unique, but I think the metaphysical component is also what he's worried about. He thinks that the metaphysical component is also part and parcel of what's worrying about it. Because it's one thing to claim, I mean, it's one thing to claim, if I make a scientific claim and I'm wrong, like I make a scientific claim that out of Africa is false, I can be disproven, and I can be disproven and I can be shown that my position's wrong. If I claim that I'm talking from the Akashic record or for the ancestors or from the spirits, there's nothing there's no way I can be proven wrong. And especially if what I'm claiming comes from that world of unverified personal gnosis, if that stuff happens to be coming out that's fascist, racist, bigoted, transphobic, whatever, which he's arguing at some level it is, then that's exceptionally dangerous.
Okay, yes, I understand that point, but again, there is a large part of occultism or the occult milieu that is actually very much of a fan of critical thinking, and that's why they are attracted to our channels, which are ha- more academic. So, for instance,
Which are
something
still
that
smaller
even
than Robert Seffer's by a
yeah,
large
but
amount.
that is because, as I said, because society at large tends to value shock more. I mean, the largest channels on YouTube are about entertainment. People want to be entertained, and sometimes the shock value of something that is out there tends to prevail. But that doesn't mean that that
Well,
reflects the fact that occultism is
Robert
more
Seffer's channel
like
isn't
that.
especially shocking. I mean, in fact, you wouldn't even know he was it's funny because he's actually Jewish. He's a Jewish anti-Semite, which is just my favorite thing in the world, speaking of double consciousness. But you would know that he's like a racist until you really begin to listening, for the dog whistles between the lines. People,
I don't even not even familiar with him, to be fair.
I'll have to send you a link to his channel because that's what we're competing with, is that kind of stuff. And I think it's not an accident. Not an accident. I mean, I think Adorno's right. I think it's not an accident. I think it is in fact um, a particular kind of it's a particular kind of thing that emerges in the occult world. This is why I'm really happy when I see occultists who are actively calling it out and trying to,
Well, for instance, Coco von Stuttgart, that you are familiar with, he wrote a book called The Scientification of Religion, where he argues that actually people in the occult milieu and the esoteric milieu, which includes also paganism, shamanism, and other occult traditions, they are heavily influenced by academia and science, and they are very much interested in that. So I don't think that, as I said, I see where you're coming from, and I see your point, and I think that that is present in occultism, but I don't think that is uniquely occultist. I
yeah.
think that it is something that you find at large in society across the board. And I think that since in occultism there are experiences like unverified personal gnosis and things that um, cannot be intersubjectively proven but are still meaningful, I think that people need to be even more cautious about their experience and how these experiences affect their reality. And my impression is that there are a lot of historicists and occultists that are very well aware of that, that they can that they can distinguish between their experience and an esoteric experience and the physical world. And so, for instance, one thing that I've noticed quite often is that when practitioners have a certain um, experience in the esoteric world about health, for instance, say, for instance, they are trying to heal somebody or to heal themselves, they will always the opinion of the doctor will always prevail over what they have seen or dreamed or things of that sort. So that's the experience that I have with the practitioners that I've come in contact with. And even when I underwent the several shamanic trainings for my PhD as part of my field work, they would actually make you sign a document that says that you should always trust your doctor first. And and that what you see in your shamanic journeys and your spiritual experiences should be an aid but not something that substitutes the kind of help that you can have in the physical world. So I don't think that occultists generally tend to disregard the our intersubjective physical reality. I think that the specific type of people that do that probably fall on the under the umbrella of the conspirituality rather than, or the conspiracy theories that also are interested in occultism. But I don't think that it is that occultism particularly and uniquely fosters that kind of behavior and that kind of thinking. Absolutely not. There are so many occultists that are scientifically minded and academically trained. So I disagree with that claim by Adorno. I see where he's coming from, and I think that any kind of metaphysical statement that is meaningful to the person could be potentially be dangerous when it is applied in certain ways, in the outside world and in relation to others. But that is a larger conversation that has to do with society and the political aspect too of society.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think he would just say that that insofar as they trust science, they're betraying their actual beliefs.
I disagree with that. I
I
think that
mean,
he's missing the point of what occultism is. But that was my first sentence, I think, in the beginning
yeah,
of this series. So
right. And so yeah, for me, it's like I think he would just say that that's the proof he needs. That if you can, I mean, the amount of like I don't know homeopathic cures are out there. If you can homeopathically cure your disease or use homeopathic birth control, I'm like, okay, do that, and like see how it comes out in the wash. And I think what he's going to say is, if you don't, then you're betraying your confidence. Like, trust the Akashic record or trust the science, but
my
not both.
experience, the again anecdotally, the experience that I have with practitioners that turn to homeopathy, they always do that after the traditional medicine has failed and they have tried everything, and then they try homeopathy. And there are some people that find that that is more effective, but it's always the second, you know the second place they go to. The preference is always towards the traditional medicine.
Right, because one is medicine.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you
But
can't.
it doesn't help all the time. It helps, most
Oh,
times. And
sure, sure, sure.
I would always argue that people go to the doctor first and not, to read the cards or the planets or anything. But I have actually met people that were not being able to be cured in the traditional way, and they actually found benefit even from quite serious illnesses with homeopathy. So I don't want to bash that either, for in acknowledgement of the people that some of whom, as I said, I know personally, that really found concrete, physical, tangible benefits.
Well, certainly they correlated. They took the homeopathic medicine and they got better. Those two things certainly correlated. Um,
They still got better. So,
yeah, again, correlation's great. But
and
again,
why the correlation was not working with the traditional medicine then?
because osteopathic and allopathic medicine just doesn't work all the time. I mean, some diseases are just, you can't beat them. So yeah, any scientific theory of medicine is going to fail because it has to make claims about what it can and can't do, and there are many things it just can't do. Like no amount of no amount of medicine is going to cure some things. It's just not within the purview until we get CRISPR and something going, but not until then. But 7. So we're down with 7. We have 3 more to go. I think we can finish next time. I think we
Sure.
can finish. And then you have to find some other way to keep your blood pressure up. I'm just gonna text you random Adorno quotes that I know. It's medicine. I'm
You
just helping you.
you should do that more over summer because that's when my blood pressure gets worse.
It's all the sun. It's like your vampirism. You need to get something like some Adorno critical theory, just like what is it? Occultism is the metaphysics of dunces. I'll send you that, and it'll help you.
Yes, thank you. I'm glad to have such a considerate friend.
See, I'm just trying to be the best friend I can be, just by helping you get your daily intake of Adorno. God, it sounds awful. All right, folks. Well, thank you for slodging through another thing of Theodore Adorno. I hope my slides are helpful in terms of actually getting his arguments. I'll finish the last 3 before we start next time. But Angela, also thank you for knocking him down, taking him down a notch.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you everybody for listening to us.
Yeah, this it's a great conversation. It's a lot of fun. So the chat is like really, really hilariously great. There's all kinds of great stuff in there. I love the arguments that develop. I love reading them later. All right, folks. Well, I think we're gonna take a breather. It's been 2 hours of dense Adorno blood pressure treatment for Dr. Puka. So we'll come back in a couple of weeks and finish up Adorno, I think, and move on to something else. If you're more keen on more mysticism, I think provisionally I've lined up another YouTuber who you may know, and we're going to be working through maybe a sermon of Meister Eckhart. So if all the Adorno scientific materialism stuff has got you down, then come back in a little while and get some good doses of hardcore mysticism. The only kind of thing you could get here in Esoterica is go from Adorno to 13th and 14th century mystics in one channel. So
and check
right,
out
Dan.
my channel too in case you're not subscribed yet.
Yes, if you're not subscribed, go check out Dr. Puka's channel and support her work. She's doing really, really important work, making so much of this stuff accessible. So folks should support your educators. Support your educators, because we know that the institutions won't. All right, everybody. Well, I'll see folks Friday, tomorrow, for Gnosticism. So the complete opposite of what I've been peddling today. So come hang out for Gnosticism tomorrow. All right, folks. See y'all tomorrow.
Bye.